Welcome everyone to this week's lesson overview for Sunday, November the 27th. We're continuing on in our study of the life of Joseph and his encounters with God. And this week we're on probably the most soap opera of the stories. This is Joseph's encounter with Potiphar's wife. We're in Genesis 36. And we're also going to be jumping over to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. So we're talking all this lesson about refusing temptation and looking at the biblical truth that when we feel tempted, we can choose not to sin. And that's a really interesting truth to be looking at, because we read that and our first question is this true? I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, don't we have a sin nature? And are therefore doomed to sin? I mean, isn't one of the big points of the whole Bible, for all of sin and come short of the glory of God? Is there any chance that we could somehow not sin? Because we as believers, we continue to sin. We see ourselves sinning daily. So what's this whole business about being able to resist the temptation? Second question it brings up, when you look at 1 Corinthians 10, is that if God will not let me be tempted beyond my ability, then why do I still sin? If God is still somehow in control of situations I find myself, and if He is somehow limiting the temptation with which I am facing, then why am I still yielding to temptation? So this is a good lesson for us to look at, because temptation is something we're always going to deal with, and we see in the life of Joseph a phenomenal example of how we need to handle and face temptation. We're going to be drawing this verse from 1 Corinthians in to help us get a good handle on it. And so what I want to do is I want to just camp out on 1 Corinthians 10:13, because this is where it all drives home, and it does come with these logical questions that many may have. First of all, let's talk about what 1 Corinthians 10:13 does not say. It doesn't say that, it does not promise that God will keep a Christian from yielding to temptation. And that's an important thing for us to point out, because if 1 Corinthians 10:13 was trying to tell us that God will keep a Christian from yielding to temptation, there are very strong theological and practical implications to that. That would mean that if a believer were to sin, then they were not really saved, and somehow salvation could be lost to them, because if they were saved, then God would be keeping them from yielding to temptation. So that's totally not in sync with what Scripture teaches. We know that we are secure in our salvation. So this is not a promise to us that somehow God is going to keep believers, keep Christians from sinning. So what does this say? It does say that sufficient cause for obedience will always be given during a time of temptation. And we're talking about cause for obedience here because the opposite of yielding to temptation is obedience to God. And so whenever we're faced with temptation, God is, yes, in control of the situation, and He is always going to give a sufficient cause for us to obey Him when we're faced with that temptation. So what is that way out? And when the verse 13 talks about providing a way of escape, I mean, what is that? What does that obedience look like? Basically, there's going to be some evidence that God is more to be desired than sin. Ultimately, what temptation is giving into something that we desire more than we desire God. We feel that at that moment that is something we need, that is going to be appropriate for us more than God is, and we give into that, and therefore we sin. And so when we're faced with temptation, there's got to be something that draws us back to God, some evidence that we can pull on as believers that allows us to escape and to resist temptation. It may be a verse of Scripture, it may be promises of God have made to us. Quite frankly, it may be the threats of the repercussions of sin that we find in Scripture. And it may be the consequences that we think of in committing this sin. It may be a word of encouragement from a fellow believer. It could be anything that draws us back to God and gives us evidence in our lives that God ought to be more desired than sin. Bottom line is, We've got to love Jesus more than we love sin. And the reason why we sin is because we love sin more than we love Jesus. And so that's the crux here of 1 Corinthians 10:13 in dealing with this idea that God does not tempt us beyond what we can handle, and there's always a way of escape. God is not somehow keeping us from sin, keeping us from being tempted, but that escape that we have is God Himself, and the fact that He should be desired more than we desire sin. So as you're talking about this lesson, you're talking about this issue of resisting temptation, you're looking at the story of Joseph, we really want to drive home this point. Now, getting back to the story of Joseph, obviously we've got this situation with Joseph and Potiphar's wife. We know the story, very familiar with it, and how she just pursued him relentlessly, trying to get him to do all kinds of sexual favors with her under Potiphar's nose almost, and how he resists that, and how he does that by basically desiring God more than he desired to do with Potiphar's wife what she was suggesting he do. So let's look at some teaching tips here. Bottom line is, don't be afraid to address the reality of temptation for sexual sin. This lesson is about sexual sin. We can talk about any temptations whatsoever. I mean, there are temptations regarding our finances. There are temptations regarding relationships. It just runs the gambit. But this lesson in particular does deal with sexual sin. So I think it's important for us to at least take the moment to address the reality of those temptations in the lives of our people. It doesn't matter if we are teaching singles, married, if we have divorce in our classes. If we're breathing, then we are faced with the temptation of sexual sin on a daily basis. I mean, just look at our culture, look at our society, look at what is presented to us and accessible to us over the media, internet, TV, movies, and things like that. Facebook has even become a big conveyor of sexual temptation for people. I mean, I consistently hear stories. I heard one just last week from a friend of mine. Her dad left the mom after 41 years of marriage because he hooked up with somebody, an old friend from his past on Facebook. And we've heard these stories before. So people are dealing with sexual temptation, and let's not be afraid to skirt around that issue because it may be uncomfortable. We need to address that. We don't have to try to be harsh and browbeat people. We want to give them the encouragement this lesson, these texts, gives to us, and the fact that God is there and God is providing that way out, and that way out is Him. So don't be afraid to address sexual temptation that is going on in your class, because statistically speaking, there's somebody in your class that's probably neck deep in it, in pornography, in fornication, in adultery. And we don't need to say that, well, this is the church, nobody deals with it. Yes, we do. And we need to address that. Emphasize the fact that it is God and our desire for Him that will allow us to escape from temptation, not our morality, sense of ethics, religion, or deeply held convictions. If we are relying on these things to help us escape temptation, and that's the conventional wisdom of the day, is these are the things you rely on, these deeply held convictions, your sense of morality, what is right, what is wrong, what's your ethics state, what your religion prescribes for you. That's how you resist temptation. But the fact of the matter is, what Scripture teaches us is that we've got to desire God above all things. That is what helps us to avoid and to escape temptation when it arises. So encourage your people that if they are finding themselves repeat offenders in various sins, ask them, what are you relying on to resist temptation? Is it something that is within yourself, such as your sense of morality, or these things here? Or are you being drawn to God Himself and the fact that He ought to be desired more than the sin that we're being tempted with? So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Obviously, this is a holiday week, so I want you guys all to have a wonderful Thanksgiving day. I hope you're with family. I hope you're enjoying that time. I'm thankful for you guys as teachers and leaders in our church. So I'll be praying for you as always, and Lord willing, I look forward to seeing you this Sunday. Thank you all so very much.